All right, so you guys wanted a deep dive into the Israel-Iran situation, huh? And yeah, it's definitely got everyone on edge. Just look at those recent missile exchanges. It's a bit unnerving, isn't it?
Yeah, it really does feel like all that tension and mistrust that's been building up for years, it's like it's reaching a boiling point, you
Yeah.
know? And then you've got the whole nuclear question looming over everything.
Right, right. Okay, let's rewind a bit and talk about that Iranian ballistic missile attack that happened on October 1st. I mean, over 180 missiles hitting Israel. It was a pretty bold move. Why'd they do it?
Well, they say it was retaliation, but to really understand what's going on, you have to look at what happened earlier this year. There were all those assassinations of those high-profile figures, like the head of Hezbollah.
Oh, right.
I
And
mean,
that
yeah,
top Iranian commander?
exactly. And then, of course, there was the assassination of Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh. And that happened right in Tehran.
Wow.
For Iran, that was intensely personal.
So basically, the October 1st attack, it was their way of saying, hey, we're not backing down. Like, don't mess with us.
Exactly. They wanted to show they weren't intimidated. But it's like they're playing with fire. You know, even though Israel managed to intercept most of those missiles, some of them did hit their targets. And that just reminds everyone of how destructive things could get.
Absolutely. And then Israel responded pretty quickly, didn't they? With those airstrikes on Iranian manufacturing sites and all those missile launching sites. I mean, it was definitely a message.
Oh, yeah, it was a clear message. They were showing their muscle, but not going over the edge into a full-blown war. It was strategic deterrence. Basically saying, if you keep pushing, we'll hit back even harder.
It's like this endless cycle, attack, retaliation. It makes you wonder if they'll ever break free from this eye for an eye thing, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. But to figure that out, we have to look beyond these immediate back and forths and try to understand that deeper conflict that's been bubbling away for years.
You're talking about the whole shadow war thing, right? It
Uh,
sounds like something out of a spy movie.
exactly. We're talking sabotage, assassinations, cyber attacks, stuff that both sides deny being involved in, but it's pretty clear they are.
Hmm.
And it's been going on for a while. I mean, Israel's been hitting Iranian targets in Syria for years now, trying to stop them from establishing a strong military presence there. And they've also been targeting those weapon shipments going to Hezbollah in Lebanon.
So how has Iran been retaliating in this shadow war?
Well, they've been using drones and missiles to attack Israeli ships in the Persian Gulf. And there's also been talk of them launching cyber attacks against Israeli infrastructure.
It's like they're playing a high-stakes chess match, but in the shadows. But, okay, here's the big question. Why all this animosity in the first place? Like, why can't they just, live and let live?
Right. Well, that's where the ideology comes in. The Iranian government, being a theocracy, they just don't accept Israel's right to exist, period. They see it as this illegitimate state that's taking up Muslim land.
Yeah, and I remember Ayatollah Khamenei even called Israel a cancerous tumor once. Didn't exactly help things, did it?
Nope. Statements like that just fuel the fire and make a lot of Israelis view Iran as an existential threat. And that fear is just made worse by all those proxy groups that Iran backs.
Like Hezbollah in Lebanon
Yeah.
and Hamas in Gaza and those Shia militias that are active in Iraq, right?
Exactly. Those groups are all challenging Israel's interests, and Iran supports them by giving them money, training them, and supplying weapons. They basically become extensions of Iran's power. And for Israel, that's a constant challenge to their security on multiple fronts.
So every time they think they've dealt with one problem, another one pops up somewhere else. But let's switch gears a bit and talk military strength for a second. Like, if we just looked at it on paper, who's got the upper hand?
That's tough to say. Israel definitely has a more advanced military. Their air force is top-notch, especially with those F-35 stealth jets. Plus, they have a really well-trained army that's super tech-savvy. And then there's the whole elephant in the room, the question of whether they have nukes.
Ah, yeah, that strategic ambiguity thing, right? They never actually say yes or no, but most experts think they have a decent stockpile. And that adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing, doesn't it?
For sure. But Iran does have some advantages too. They have a much bigger land area and a larger population. Plus, their ballistic missile program, as we've seen, can hit pretty deep into Israeli territory.
So it's high tech versus, well, just plain size. But on top of all that, we have to talk about the whole thing with Iran possibly developing their own nuclear weapons. That's got to be making everyone pretty nervous.
Oh, absolutely. The idea of Iran having nukes is a major concern for Israel, the U.S., and pretty much the entire international community. It could completely destabilize the whole region. It's a potential game changer.
I remember that UN report from earlier this year. It said Iran was just weeks away from having enough material for a bomb. It felt pretty urgent back then. But hold on, having the materials isn't the same as actually having a weapon, right?
Right, that's true. There are still some big technical hurdles they have to overcome, like enriching uranium to weapons-grade levels and figuring out the tech to build a warhead that they can actually deliver. But still, the threat is serious enough to keep everyone on their toes.
So they might not be there yet, but just the possibility is enough to keep tensions running super high. It feels like we're always teetering on the edge of something much, much bigger.
It's a dangerous game they're playing, no doubt. But before we go any further down that road, let's zoom out a little. Let's look at all the alliances that are swirling around this conflict. I mean, Israel has some powerful friends, right?
Well, the U.S. has been a strong ally for decades, that's for sure. They provide a lot of military and financial support. And then you got the Abraham Accords, which normalized relations with a bunch of Arab nations like the UAE and Bahrain. And a
Yeah.
big part of why those agreements happened was because they're all worried about Iran getting too powerful.
Those alliances are really important for Israel, both for their security and for their standing in the region.
Yeah, the Abraham Accords were a big deal, for sure. I mean, they kind of show how the Middle East is changing. You have some Arab states that are like, okay, dealing with Iran is more important than old rivalries. It's interesting, right?
It is. So a common enemy can bring old enemies together, huh? It's kind of a crazy thought. But what about everyone else? Are other countries just watching all this happen?
Not really. It's more like they're trying to figure out how to deal with this whole situation, without getting dragged in too deep.
Hmm.
Like some European countries, they're still trying to make that Iran nuclear deal work, hoping that if they talk it out, maybe Iran won't build nukes.
But hasn't that deal been pretty shaky since the U.S. pulled out back in 2018? Yeah, that was a big moment. When the Trump administration pulled out and put sanctions back on, it really messed things up, set things back, with trying to control Iran's nuclear program. And it's strained relations big time. The Biden administration's been trying to get it back on track, but talks have stalled.
Sounds like we're stuck. What about China? They're a big player in the world. Where do they stand on all this?
They're doing this kind of balancing act, trying to keep both Iran and Israel happy, which is tough. They have a lot of economic interest in the region, especially because Iran's a major oil supplier.
It seems like oil always manages to complicate things, doesn't it? You mentioned the Abraham Accords earlier, those peace deals with Israel and some Arab countries. How much do those agreements actually change things, in the big picture?
The Abraham Accords, well, those were signed back in 2020. And honestly, that was historic. Israel making official diplomatic ties with places like the UAE and Bahrain, even Morocco and Sudan. A few years ago, no one would have believed it.
It sounds like a major win for Israel. Does this mean things are shifting in the region? Like, is the balance of power changing?
It's something Iran's definitely watching closely. These agreements could really weaken Iran's position and give Israel a bigger voice. But remember that Abraham Accords, they don't deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's still a big issue, a big complication in the region.
Sure, of course, the Palestinian issue, it's always another layer of complexity in this whole thing. Okay, so we've talked about Israel having that technological edge and Iran having that missile force and this whole shadow war thing. But what about a real war, like an all-out conventional war? Is that something we should be seriously worried about?
I mean, no one wants that,
Got
but it is a possibility. We can't pretend it's not. A war between Israel and Iran would be devastating for everyone, and it could easily drag other countries into the fight. It could become a much bigger conflict, and the consequences, well, they'd be unimaginable.
I get what you're saying. You mentioned earlier that neither side wants to let things get out of hand, that they're playing a dangerous game, testing each other's limits. But are there any signs that they're actually trying to avoid a full-blown war?
I think there's definitely some calculated risk-taking going on. They're pushing each other, sending signals, but they don't want things to get out of control, at least not yet.
Mhm.
But things are so unpredictable, right? One wrong move, one miscalculation, and it could all go up in flames.
It's like walking on a tightrope, and the ground's a long way down. We talked earlier about some glimmers of hope, things that could maybe make things better. Remind me, what were those again? I think we could all use a bit of good news here.
Well, one thing is, even with all the tough talk and those military clashes, there have been moments where both sides have held back.
Okay, so they're not completely reckless.
Right. It's like they both know how disastrous a full-blown war would be.
Hmm.
And at least for now, they're trying to avoid that.
Okay, that's something. Anything else?
And then there's, even if it's happening quietly, there are attempts to open up communication channels. Those behind-the-scenes talks, they don't always make the news, but they're super important because they can help to clear up misunderstandings,
Yeah.
deal with those sudden crises, and maybe, just maybe, start to build some trust.
So even when things look really bad, there's still a chance for diplomacy to work.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the pressure from the rest of the world. Most countries really don't want this conflict to escalate. They're pushing both sides to find a peaceful solution and just chill out a bit.
Yeah, in today's world, everyone's connected, right? No one can ignore something this big, especially when there's a chance of nuclear weapons getting involved.
Exactly. A nuclear arms race in the Middle East. No one wants to see that. So the international community has to do whatever it can to prevent that from happening.
Well, that's somewhat reassuring, but it still feels like we're sitting on a powder keg here. What are some of the things, the events that could make things really blow up?
The big one, the obvious one, is Iran's nuclear program. If they actually decide to build a nuke, it would almost definitely trigger a military response from Israel. And that could easily start a regional war.
Yeah, that's one everyone's worried about. Anything else that could set things off.
Another thing that could trigger it is a major attack by one of those Iranian proxy groups, like Hezbollah. If they hit Israel hard enough, especially they cause a lot of casualties or damage crucial infrastructure, Israel might feel like they have no choice but to retaliate. And then it's like a domino effect, violence leading to more violence.
So they're trying to scare each other off, but not scare each other off too much. It sounds like a pretty delicate balancing act.
It really is. And there are no easy answers. And it's not just about military power and strategy either. We have to remember there's all this history, those cultural differences, and those ideological clashes that are fueling this whole thing. It goes deep.
Yeah, and that's what makes this conflict so fascinating and so frustrating at the same time. It's not just about land or resources. It's about identity, religion, deeply held beliefs. It's personal.
You got it. And that's what makes it so hard to find any common ground. It's hard to see how they could ever put all this behind them and live in peace.
This deep dive has been intense, I'll give you that. We started with missile strikes and shadow wars, and now we're talking about fears of nuclear weapons and how all these countries are lined up against each other. It's a lot to take in, but I feel like I understand things a lot better now, all the complexities and the risks involved.
I'm glad to hear that. These things are important to talk about, even if they make us uncomfortable, because they really do matter, and they can affect all of us.
Absolutely. Before we wrap things up, I've got one last question for you. If there's one thing our listeners should take away from all this, what would it be? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day?
It is.
Yeah.
It really is a lot to think about. All this stuff about missile strikes and shadow wars and, of course, those nuclear ambitions and all those alliances and rivalries. But I think the main thing is this conflict. It's not going away anytime soon. This is like a really deep-rooted thing going way back in history, and there are no easy fixes.
No easy fixes, that's for sure. I mean, we've been talking about historical grievances and this huge ideological divide and all the military stuff, and it just feels like, well, like it could all fall apart at any moment.
Yeah, it does. But you know what's interesting? Even with all that tension, there's this weird sense of predictability to it. It's like they've been playing this dangerous game for so long that they know all the moves. But it only takes one wrong step to mess everything up.
So where do we go from here? What are the things that could make things better? Or worse? Like, could we see a real de-escalation, or could this turn into an all-out regional war?
Well, if we look at the big picture, a few things could tip the scales. First, there's the Iran nuclear deal. If they can revive that and Iran actually starts scaling back its nuclear program, that could help a lot. At least in the short term. It wouldn't solve all the problems, but it's a start.
So diplomacy, huh? Even if it's a long shot, it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it's a glimmer of hope in a pretty dark situation. On the other hand, though, if Iran keeps pushing towards getting a nuke, or if one of the proxy groups pulls off a big attack, one that Israel can't just ignore, then things could get really bad really fast.
Those are the scenarios that keep people awake at night.
Right.
But what would de-escalation actually look like? I mean, how do you even start to dial things back when everything's so tense?
It would take a lot of things happening at once. Like they'd have to start talking again, maybe with some help from other countries. They'd need to stop all that military posturing and maybe even do some things to show they're serious about peace, like prisoner exchanges or working together on stuff like water resources.
That sounds really tough. Like, building trust when there's so much bad blood, it seems almost impossible.
It would be a long and bumpy road for sure. But history shows us that even the worst enemies can sometimes find a way to, at least tolerate each other. Maybe not true peace, but a kind of cold peace, where they can deal with their disagreements without shooting at each other.
That's an interesting thought. But for this cold peace thing to work, both sides would actually have to want it. What if one side is just set on destroying the other? Are there people, like in the governments or among their allies, who actually think a war is inevitable or even a good thing?
It's a scary thought, but it's something to consider. Sometimes people are driven by extreme ideologies or religious beliefs, or maybe they just want revenge, and that can lead to some really terrible things.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the history to the ideologies, the military stuff, and just how dangerous this whole situation is. It's given our listeners a lot to think about, wouldn't you say?
It has. And that's what we were hoping for, because this isn't just some abstract political thing happening somewhere far away. It's about real people, their lives, and the possibility of, well, a lot of suffering.
Yeah. So to our listeners, here's what we want you to remember. The Israel-Iran conflict, it's not over. It's a really dangerous situation, and it affects the whole world. Pay attention to the news, stay informed, and think critically about what you hear and read.
And as you follow this story, think about the motivations of both sides. Why are they doing what they're doing? And what could happen if they choose one path or another? And maybe the most important question is, what can we do as individuals and as a global community to try to make things better, to promote peace in a world where it feels like everything's falling apart? That's something worth thinking about.
That's a great point. A great note to end on. Thank you for taking us on this deep dive into the Israel-Iran conflict. It's been a really insightful discussion.
It's been my pleasure. And until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.